Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about science and technology for kids and others. Let's see, I see a bunch of questions saved up here. One from Oka. Books have been relatively unchanged. Would you say that that's a technology that has been mastered? It's funny because there are things which are set up to be kind of right for humans as humans are, so to speak. Like, I don't know, whether it's, you put a hat on your head, you put shoes on your feet, things like this. Those are optimized for the way that humans are, so to speak. And I think books are somewhat the same way. We have, we're using our hands, we're kind of flipping through a book. It's fairly well optimized for the way that we are and the dexterity that we have with our hands and so on. I would say that books, as a way to deliver information, it kind of looked when the web arrived as if books were kind of toast. Who wanted a book that you could flip through when you could just scroll through a website and click on links and go to all those subpages and so on. It's turned out the books have remained, I think, a useful unit of kind of information and knowledge for people. It's kind of like you have a book, you know that that's the sort of a whole story. It's not a web page where it's like you could go off and be clicking links and go for sort of thousands of steps, clicking links and so on. Books have this feature that they kind of have a certain expected structure, and you can kind of pick it up and see its length and so on. Now, it's even true with online books where there are sort of pages and you can flip through the pages and so on. It's not this kind of bottomless pit of possible material. Now, having said that, there are certainly things about online books that are very convenient relative to paper books. For instance, the fact that you can kind of click the table of contents and go somewhere. And I have to say I was amused in recent times. I don't know about you all out there today, but some sophisticated people who are now in their 30s who are like, books, they have indices at the back. I've never looked at the index in a book. That's a little disappointing for me because I've kind of put a lot of effort into making a good index for all sorts of books that I've written. What happens when you make an index in a book? How does it differ from just doing textual search in the book? For me, it's that you are defining kind of terms that aren't necessarily the precise terms that show up on pages, but it's a way of describing the concepts in the book, so to speak, that you might want to search for, independent of the particular packaging of those concepts on a page. Now, it could very well be that in modern times with semantic search that's made possible by large language models and AI and so on, that's becoming a decreasingly significant thing to do, although there isn't yet really quite a standardized way to do that kind of search. There's standardized ways to do ordinary text search. In Wolfram language, we introduced recently a kind of nice, clean way to do semantic search, but I don't think it's quite set up to be able to do the kind of concept index searches that I've built into the indices of books. It also helps if you have a written index that there is a term, and that term has a fixed number of subterms. You've got that particular term, and you kind of carefully set up the subterms. You can immediately look at those subterms. It's not something where, again, it's kind of this bottomless pit of possible search results. Now, having said all those things, there's a question of the sort of how do you make a book computable? A thing that we invented back in 1987, and now been copied many times, is the idea of computational notebooks, where you have kind of this online document that happens to have kind of sections that open and close and things like this, but more to the point, has a mixture of text together with images and code. What to me is important in the computational notebooks we've built is that code is Wolfram language code, which is code that's intended to be read as well as to be written. So it's code that kind of helps explain what you're trying to explain, so to speak. That it's not just code that's intended for consumption by a computer, it's code that is set up to be sort of a computational description of what's going on. Much like if you read a book that has math in it, the math is expected to carry some of the exposition, by what's specified in the math. So similarly, the Wolfram language code, the computational language code, is supposed to carry, if it's written well, some of the exposition of what's going on in the document. But it's also runnable, which means that your document becomes this kind of infinite thing that can immediately be used in addition to being just read and ingested in sort of your own mind, so to speak. It's something where, in addition to being sort of absorbed by your mind, it's also something where you can immediately use it on a computer. Now, in terms of the technology, you asked about making books. In terms of the technology for making books, yes, it's at this point, I would say, reasonably mature. I mean, there was a big step forward maybe, when was it, 15, 20 years ago, when print-on-demand books became viable. So, the history of books, well, back in the day, folks like monks and so on would do lots of and other scribes would do all kinds of copying of books. The only way to get a copy of a book was to have somebody handwrite a version of a book that had already been written, because the only way to present books was by writing them by hand like that. Then about 500 years ago, along came the idea of movable type and so on, and the idea that you could print a book by having little, in that case, it was all sorts of different separate letters that were made out of blocks of, well, I think wood and then lead, where you would pick up, the letter T from one bin, and the letter E from another, letter H from another bin, letter E from another bin. You would put those pieces of type in a kind of frame. You would build up this whole big frame that was a kind of inverted picture of a page that you wanted to print, and then you'd put ink on that type. The parts of it that you wanted to kind of show up will be raised relative to the other ones. You put that ink on, and then you make an impression on a piece of paper, and that's how you print a page. And you can go and do that many times. So there were books that were being printed in the 1500s, 1600s, and so on. And, a typical book might have a few hundred, maybe 1,000, maybe a couple of thousand copies that were kind of running off the press. And, eventually the type would kind of wear down, you'd have to replace it and so on. But it was much more efficient than having somebody sort of hand write the material. And after you had maybe after you used type for one page, if you hadn't sort of worn it down, you could break up that type again and use it again for a different book. And people would routinely, they would start running off copies of a book, and they'd notice typos in the book. And as they were running off different sheets of paper for the book, they'd make changes to fix those typos. And so you could tell, like, oh, I've got this copy of this book printed in 1650 or something, where this book was the version of it that I got printed was printed a bit after the version that so-and-so got printed, because it has more typos fixed. Actually, they would often take, so the way books are made, they they're usually made with, at least in the past, this was how they were done. They were made with these folios, these big sheets of paper, like eight pages all together, that were in a big sheet, and then that would get printed, and then in order to actually construct the book, you would fold up that page, and then you would kind of sew that page into the binding of the book, to sew that folded thing into the binding of the book, so that you could get to the so-called signature of the book. These multiple signatures, each one kind of a folded version of a big sheet of paper, and then sort of sewn into the binding of the book. So there was the sort of big thing that happened in the early part of the 20th century was kind of lithography, being able to sort of etch out these big sheets of metal that had where you were etching away parts of the metal to form the thing that you wanted to print, rather than taking pieces of type that you were sort of building up in a frame yourself. you could instead take something which sort of photographically represented, then just etch out pieces of this big sheet of metal, and then use that big sheet of metal as the thing that you printed with. And that's kind of the way that, well, printing was done. Lots of printing is still done that way. There's a more elaborate sort of method, a thing called the web press, that is a kind of a giant industrial machine, kind of almost city block sized, that has not quite that big, but they're big machines that in which paper will go through at 100 miles an hour or something, having printing done on it. That's the way newspapers have typically been printed. It's the way kind of books that are sold in very large numbers and where it doesn't so much matter what the quality of printing is, are printed. And those are kind of those are two technologies. And then there's the kind of the modern print on demand technology, which is more laser printer based. The quality of laser printers has gotten to the point where it's possible to do that. So, I mean, in general terms, I'm trying to remember all these numbers, but the real question is, what's the resolution of printing in dots per inch? So when you print something, there's a question of like, okay, if you type a period, how small can that period be? And how much is it, or how precise can the edges of letters be? And so that's kind of measured in a dots per inch resolution. So the early laser printers were like 300 dots per inch. And the typical printing was, if I remember correctly, 2450 dots per inch. So nearly a factor of 10 in linear dimensions, which is a factor of 100 in area, difference between what you could get between the resolution that you could get on a laser printer, an early laser printer from the 1980s, and a standard printing press where you'd etched out these plates for lithography and so on. That difference has gradually gotten smaller, although still laser printers are not up to the full resolution, I think, of a high quality printing press. Those resolutions matter in all sorts of different ways. So, for example, one issue is how do you do color printing? Well, you might say, okay, I want to get this weird shade of purple. How do I get that in my book? Well, if you had ink that was that weird shade of purple, then you could just sort of put it on your printing plate and print in that weird shade of purple. But you're not going to have all the possible colors. So how do you do it? Well, you do the same thing that displays do. You combine kind of certain amounts of the different sort of primary colors to get the final thing that you want to print. For a screen, the primary colors are red, green, and blue. Those are the colors that the photoreceptors in our eyes pick up. For printing, well, in a screen, what matters is you're generating light. And so you're generating a certain amount of red light, a certain amount of green light, a certain amount of blue light in the different little pixels on your screen. And those things are exciting the different photoreceptors, the red, green, and blue cone cell receptors in our eyes. In the case of printing, it's a little bit different because what's happening is a white piece of paper is kind of reflecting sort of all colors of light equally. But if you want to have something that looks red, what you want is that the red light is reflected and everything else is absorbed. And so you end up with these kind of complementary colors, these subtractive versions of colors that you have to combine. And so in the case of printing, the primary colors that are used are not red, green, and blue, but instead the complementary colors, cyan, magenta, and yellow. It's always very confusing because cyan is kind of like blue, magenta is kind of like red, yellow is different but it's sort of confusing because it's red, green, blue, but it's the sort of the red and green is sort of still there in the subtractive primaries, but they're different colors actually. They're magenta and cyan in that case. So that would suggest you could just have, well, a certain amount of cyan, a certain amount of magenta, and so on. If you just mix the inks together, that wouldn't work because you just get a sort of a mess of liquid from those two inks mixing together. So instead, what's done is that the different kind of the cyan, magenta, and yellow, and so on, are all placed in different dots on the page. It's a little bit similar to what happens on a display screen, because on a display screen, if you look on a magnifying glass at your display, you'll see that there are little rectangles usually, which are red, green, blue rectangles on the screen. And so if you look at an area on the screen that's white, you'll see those equally lit up. If you look at an area that's red, you'll see just the red ones and you won't see the green and blue ones. So if you look at a piece of printing under a magnifying glass, you'll see a whole bunch of dots. You'll see a whole big array of dots. So-called, I'd say slightly confusingly, they're called screens usually. Not screens because they are like display screens, but screens because the way that those dots could be thought of as laid down is by having some kind of fabric that has little holes in it. That's not how it's actually done, but that's sort of a concept for how it could be done. I think it's how it was done at one point. But what happens is that if you look at these, you look at the piece of color printing, you're mixing the cyan, magenta, and yellow. You're mixing them by the sizes of the dots. So there's a fixed array of dots that are where the cyan goes, where the yellow goes, where the magenta goes. And the question is, how big are those dots? If the yellow dots are big, the cyan dots are small, you'll mostly see yellow there, and so on. And there's a whole art to how those arrays of dots work. They're basically they're sort of arrays that are at different angles. There are particular angles for that these lines of dots are aligned at. Those angles are set up that way in order to avoid you visually seeing kind of large-scale moire patterns. You get moire patterns if you have two sort of grids of lines and you turn them at a certain angle. At some angles, you'll start seeing the lines sort of line up every so often. It's kind of a question of it's like a question of number theory. It's a question of sort of when do you get a bunch of fractions that are fractions where you can cancel between the numerator and denominator. Instead of 7/11ths, you're getting 6/10ths, which is the same as 3/5ths. That sort of ability to cancel like that is something that sort of shows up in a bunch of dots being a bunch of intersections between lines being aligned, and it becomes very visually obvious that there's kind of this instead of you just seeing a uniform area of color, you'll see these kind of lines of different colors there, and that's avoided by having these kind of sort of irregular angles between these dots. So that's kind of the method for color printing. Sometimes, usually, what's done in printing is you have cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. The black is kind of printed separately with its own separate black ink. And then often, if you're making a very sort of plush piece of printing that has some particular color, like that strange shade of purple, really emphasized, you'll actually get ink that's that color, and you'll make that as a separate piece of printing. So it's pretty common that when we'll do so-called four-color printing, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, but for sort of fancier things, when we'll often have six-color printing, where one has a couple of spot colors, so to speak, added on, which are specific inks that are those particular colors. So these are things which are kind of part of the story of how printing gets done. I would say when it comes to the printing of books, it was the case like 20 years ago, printing a color book was a much more expensive proposition than printing a black and white book. At this point, sort of so much has been done in color printing that I think the price of printing in color has come down to the point where sometimes it's kind of like if you want to get black and white photographs developed from film now, you have to send them off to a specialty place to have that done. Whereas even 20 years ago, any old sort of place that developed any old pharmacy would have some way of developing film and so on, including black and white film. But it's now become, well, as with book printing, it's become sort of so routine to print things in color that's become much cheaper, just as a matter of sort of economy of scale. And I think there's a whole other story about the technology of book binding. I mentioned before that the typical traditional thing to do is to make these big sheets of paper and then fold them up. So when you look at how they're printed, it's kind of like there's a complicated arrangement of pages, but when you fold them, the pages all end up in the right place. And then then to attach all those signatures, as they're called, together into the spine of the book. You are doing, in the past, you would do some literal sewing where you would have a thread that sort of sewed the back of the signature into the spine of the book. There's a different technique, so-called perfect binding, where essentially all the pages are just stuck into a big piece of glue, and every page is just attached by the fact that at the edge of the page there's glue. It doesn't work quite so well. It's it's usually called Smythe sewing, this approach of having actual threads in there. Sometimes there's fake Smythe sewing. You look at the top and bottom of a book, you'll see this kind of, the top and bottom look like there are threads there, but it's just a fake. It's just an applied thing, and it's really glued. And sometimes you would glue these signatures and so on. There's different approaches to this. I have to say that in various books we produced in the early 1990s, published by publishing companies for us, they had all kinds of problems with the different types of binding that were used, and there's sort of the question of how flat does the book lay when you open it, and if you lay it flat, does the binding break and the pages start coming out? All those kinds of things. There are kind of lovely there are companies that will do testing of books where they basically will take your book and they'll put it in something like something that's a dry washing machine, so to speak, that will just or it'll just tumble the book around many times. So you can tumble it 1,000 times or something, and you ask, when does the book start to fall apart when it's tumbled that way? And that's kind of a way of assessing the kind of the longevity and strength of the book. All right, a few comments about books. Let's see. Let me see. A bunch of more sophisticated questions here. Okay, Lucas says, the son asks, given there's a maximum amount of information you can store in a given region of space, how can we simulate complex systems like brains or universes without exceeding physical limits? Interesting question. So it is, I think, true, based on the model of physics that we now have, that I kind of initiated, well, most seriously about 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. We think of the universe, kind of the lowest level structure of the universe, as this kind of discrete thing with a sort of discrete collection of atoms of space. There are lots of atoms of space, but there are a finite number of atoms of space. It's not an infinite number of atoms of space. And that means that the connections between those atoms of space, which define kind of the structure of the universe and everything in it, there's only a limited collection of configurations of that. So therefore, in a given region of space, so to speak, there's only a limited amount of information that can be stored. It's very, very, very big. It's worth realizing that, if you have something where there are a certain number of elements in the thing, and each of those elements can have multiple choices, you very quickly get up to very huge numbers of possible choices for the whole thing. So let's say, for example, that you have, I don't know, 10 sort of elements, and they can each be either a 1 or a 0. They're 10 bits, each either 1 or 0. Well, the number of possible configurations of 10 bits is 2 to the 10, which is 1,024. If we go to, let's say, 32 bits, we've got to 4 billion possibilities for the number of configurations of that whole arrangement of 32 bits. And as we go on, we quickly get, so by the time we're at, let's see if I can do this in my head, by about 40 bits, the number of possible configurations of 40 bits, I think this is right. Let me see if I can work that out. No, I'm not going to get this right. No, I should say when it's at 100 bits, the number of possible configurations of 100 bits, 2 to the power 100, which is larger than the number of atoms in the universe. So it takes only 100 bits. Now, remember, your computer might have many billions of bits of memory. So the total number of possible configurations of your computer is absurdly larger than the number of possible atoms in the universe. So it's very easy to get very large sort of numbers of possible configurations of things very quickly. Now, there's a question, if you want to sort of simulate the universe in perfect detail, well, then you need as many sort of bits of information as the universe has. And if you want to simulate a lump of space perfectly, then you certainly need as many bits as there are in that lump of space. And if you but you're never in order to do that, you can if you'd have to have each bit in the simulation you're doing might have to be something like a single atom of space to be able to get enough information density to simulate that region of space. But the problem is that if you want to kind of humanly interact with the system, we humans don't get to interact with individual atoms of space for sure. It's really difficult for us to interact even with individual atoms. There's a lot of effort in quantum computing where people try to have individual atoms sort of trapped in electromagnetic fields and kind of separated from all other atoms enough that they can manipulate that atom on its own. But that's hard work. And people can typically, maybe they get 50, 100 atoms. That's kind of high tech at this point for being able to manipulate atoms on their own. So it's to simulate sort of the universe in perfect detail, you need the universe to be able to do that. The good news is that the universe is fairly homogeneous. So if you're trying to simulate properties of the structure of space, for example, one piece of space here is pretty similar to another piece of space there. And so you can do a simulation that just involves this small region of space, which you have a better hope to be able to do than being able to simulate sort of the whole universe. When it comes to brains, well, we've got about 100 billion neurons in our brains. And 100 billion is your typical computer that might have maybe 10 gigabytes of memory. That's 80 billion bits of memory. Well, that's about similar to the number of bits of memory in your typical computer is pretty similar to the number of neurons in our brains. Now, so then the question is, well, what features of those neurons are important in the way that brains work? How much information do we need to have about each neuron to be able to get the neurons to be able to simulate what neurons are doing fairly accurately? We don't know the answer to that. But sort of artificial neural nets, which are kind of very idealized versions of brains, typically these days, well, people sometimes use 32 bits. It's for every connection between neurons. There are more connections between the neurons than there are neurons themselves. Like in our brains, there are about 100 trillion connections between neurons, 100 billion neurons, and 100 trillion connections between neurons. So every neuron on average has maybe 1,000 connections. In an artificial neural net, one's sort of particularly representing those connections, so-called weights in the neural net. And in what was originally done is to say we're going to use a computer machine number that's maybe 64 bits of information to represent that precise weight that's going to be used in that neural net. These days, it's become common to use quantized weights where you have maybe 8 bits per weight or even 4 bits per weight. I did some work a few months ago looking at what happens if you just have 1 bit per weight effectively, and you sort of develop things, you train things, you learn things just with 1 bit per weight, and you can do it. So to this question of how much detail do you need to simulate a brain, there's a the it's a question of what do you want to simulate in the brain. If you want to simulate sort of every detailed chemical process in the brain, you have to simulate every molecule in every neuron, and there are a very large number of molecules in each neuron in the brain. If you want to simulate just kind of the computational aspects of neurons, it seems as if it's enough to use just a modest number of bits per neuron to do that simulation. That's not known for sure. It's a question of, well, what do you want your brain to do? If you want your brain to be able to write an essay and speak and things like this, as of a few years ago, we just had no idea how much kind of computational material would be needed to do that. Post kind of ChatGPT and so on, we now know that with modest numbers, billions of connections and millions of neurons, it's perfectly possible to get something which has a good approximation to sort of human-like kind of generation of text and even speaking and so on. So it seems like the stuff we need in order to simulate a brain is to simulate sort of the informational aspects of a brain is that fairly modest kind of thing of maybe billions of weights and so on, kinds of things that will sort of fit in a computer. To do it efficiently, because one's trying to sort of work out lots of things in parallel, one tends to use GPUs, graphics processing units. I don't know whether people still think of GPUs as being graphics processing units. They're particularly used now for machine learning and so on. But in any case, so the things about brains that are important for doing sort of informational processing, you seem to just have to say, oh, it's some number of bits per neuron. Now, it's a question of, well, if you really want to get fully into sort of the human experience of brains, how much more information do you need about each neuron? One doesn't know the answer to that. It's sort of a question, people are curious whether you could simulate a whole human brain in sufficient accuracy that you'd be like talking to the person, so to speak. Right now, we don't have a good way to read out kind of all of the weights, the memories, and so on from a human brain. The first thing that's been done there is recently done, a few months ago, is the fly connectome, as it's called, the connections between all the neurons. There are about 200,000 neurons in a fly brain, and the complete structure of how neurons are connected to each other has been decoded. And one might think, okay, then we can simulate a fly perfectly. Not clear how well that's going to work. I mean, we've known for 30 years the complete 1,500 or so neurons that exist in a particular type of worm, nematode, tiny worms, where the complete structure of all the cells in the organism are known, including the nerve cells, of which represent a significant part of all the cells in the organism. And actually, those particular organisms, they pretty much every organism of that type arranges its nerve cells in the same way. But even though we know the configuration of those nerve cells, we don't know enough about how the nerve cells work to be able to simulate perfectly the behavior of that worm. And so we're still pretty far away from being able to do the behavior of the fruit fly. I mean, the issue, and people are still wondering about sort of how do nerve cells work? What's the important aspect of how they work? How do they store memory, for example? So there are various different theories about this. I mean, one thing that was argued about a lot in the 1800s when people first realized that there were neurons in the brain, that there were all these separate pieces of the brain, one question was, were all those neurons connected together, or were there little synapses, little gaps between these neurons? Turns out in the end, there are little gaps between these neurons. There is a body of the neuron, which is where it's kind of getting its energy source and so on, and its cell nucleus and all that. And then there are axons that are feeding out kind of electrical signals, and there are dendrites that kind of collect those electrical signals. And there's a little gap between the axons and the dendrites. So one cell's axons will not quite connect to another cell's dendrites, but that's kind of where there's the way nerve cells work. They have electrical signals. They produce kind of electric activity, electrochemical activity, and they produce this series of electrical pulses. And those electrical pulses are the things that go down the axons and can get sort of transmitted to the dendrites of other cells and so on. So you look at a nerve cell, and you measure it electrically. It's been possible for, I don't know, 50 years or so to read out the electrical activity of a single neuron, at least a big one. The original favorite was the giant axon of the squid. Squids really care about being able to sort of get out of town quickly, and they have a very quick reaction. When something happens at one end of the squid, that the nerve impulse is transmitted to the other end of the squid very quickly through the giant axon of the squid, and that happens to be a thing that's particularly easy to measure the electrical activity in. But in general, in a nerve cell, you have all this electrical activity, and it is in spikes. So if you put a loudspeaker, connect a loudspeaker to the kind of to listen to the electrical activity of a nerve cell, you'll hear all kinds of spiking. You'll hear kind of beeps and as the nerve cell that particular nerve cell becomes active, it spikes more frequently. When it's not active, it'll spike less frequently, and that's kind of the way nerve cells work. And those spikes are electrical pulses which get transmitted from the axons of one nerve cell to the dendrites of another nerve cell. And there are channels of ions that things like calcium ions, where they're calcium atoms that have electrons removed so that they're electrically charged, and they are sort of moving from one cell to another to kind of transmit the information from one cell to another. Exactly how that works, still a little bit obscure. I mean, there are neurotransmitters, which are molecules that are associated with that process. And there are little packets of neurotransmitter, little vesicles of neurotransmitter that get released when one nerve cell has electrical activity, and that get transmitted to the other nerve cell and so on, and produce electrical activity in it. But the thing that's been believed for, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 years now, is that actually more than that, since the 1940s, is that the main kind of place where memory resides is in the characteristics of these synapses. That as you start to remember things, these synapses, these connections between nerve cells change their characteristics. And for example, one early hypothesis, so-called Hebbian hypothesis, is that nerve cells that sort of fire together get stronger synapses between them. So if two nerve cells typically are firing at the same time as a result of some stimulus that's given, then those two nerve cells will strengthen the connection between them. And that's kind of a very simple learning rule for nerve cells. But the question of exactly what is the thing that kind of determines the strength of signal transmission from one nerve cell to another is still quite unclear. I mean, is it that there are literally more little holes in the membrane of the cell where calcium ions can go through? Is it perhaps that there are molecules that are getting produced that somehow have some effect where memory is really ultimately being stored in molecules? Not clear. I mean, it's certainly true that protein synthesis, producing new molecules, does start up. It takes, maybe 15 minutes to produce new molecules in a nerve cell, as it does anywhere else, to produce new protein molecules, to get them sort of spooled out from ribosomes and so on. But the question of whether that's important to memory, we don't know. We don't know the answer to that. And it could be that short-term memory works differently from longer-term memory, that short-term memory works in one way that's possibly just sort of recirculating information, like you could have sort of a circle of neurons, which is just sending signals around from one to the next and so on. Or it could be that it's important that certain molecules get produced that lead to the memory being set up that way. But so since we don't know these kinds of things, it's hard to know for sure, what do we have to capture different aspects of human brains or other kinds of brains. And certainly when one imagines sort of a future world where we can all sort of upload our brains to digital electronics, there's definitely a question of, well, how accurately do we have to be able to simulate our brain for us to have the same kind of experience, for the uploaded brain to have the same kinds of behavior and experience that we have with our biological brains? One simply doesn't know the answer to that yet. It looked like there were many more mysteries there before things like ChatGPT showed up. That's kind of told us that there's less stuff that seems to probably matter in the operation of brains than we thought. So a few thoughts about that. Let's see. Gosh. SK comments, we're taught that science discovers truth through observation and experiment, but in practice, I see science building mathematical models that work, sometimes treated as exact reality. How do you, as a scientist, separate calculation tools from physical truth in your work? Where does experience draw that line? Well, you can do a certain number of experiments, but the key to doing theoretical science is induction from those experiments. Like you do a particular thing 10 times, the same thing happens all those 10 times you do that experiment. You might then say there's a law that that thing must happen every time I do this experiment. That's kind of the idea of scientific induction. Such a law works in many cases. In many cases, the explanation that says if it happened 10 times, it's going to keep on happening is a good explanation. That's a good extrapolation from what you saw. It's not always true. So different areas of science have very different characteristics in this regard. So for example, in physics, it's often the case that sort of the simple explanation is right. So if you saw it happen 10 times, it's going to happen that way every time. In medicine, that's not the case. In medicine, sort of the rough intuition is things are always more complicated than you could possibly imagine. And so if it happens that way 10 times for 10 patients, the 11th patient, something different might happen. It's a different kind of system, different kind of thing that's going on. So this question of you do experiments, you see things, you then try to make some model that is a kind of idealization of what you see. So what is a model? The natural world is doing what it does. It's got all these atoms and molecules and everything, and they just do what they do. A model is an attempt to make some kind of narrative, some kind of explanation of what will happen in the natural world, an explanation that's simple enough that we can work with it in our minds. So it can't be an explanation that just says, it's not a useful explanation that just says, just run everything, run every atom the way that it actually runs in nature. We want something that's a simpler scientific law that says something where we can just say, it's always going to fall, or it's always going to expand, or something like that. So there's a couple of different things to say about this. I mean, one is when can you get a simple scientific law from what happens in nature? Is that always going to be possible? And then what kinds of laws can you get? And when do you know you've got the right law, and so on? So let's talk about what happens in practice. There's a certain point of view that says that if you're making a theory, you look at the experiments, you take every experiment to be true, and then you say, well, I'm going to fit my theory to the experiments as the experiments came out. The problem with that is experiments are difficult, particularly when they're sort of the edge of what's known in science. The experiments are difficult. The theory is also difficult. It could be the case that you have some underlying theory, some sort of underlying computational or mathematical model, but then you have to deduce what the consequences of that model are for some particular circumstance. And that may be a difficult thing. It may be difficult math. It may require a complicated simulation. It may require you have to make certain approximations. You don't know whether they're correct, and so on. So both deducing from an underlying theory what you will see in a particular case and doing the experiment and measuring, having a sort of carefully enough controlled environment, making the right measurements, kind of interpreting the measurements and so on correctly, that's also difficult. So there's a pretty complicated dance between sort of the building up of the theory and the doing of the experiments and seeing whether they agree or not. And certainly in my own experience, when I was a kid, actually I did physics research, particularly in particle physics. And one of my early experiences, I probably talked about this on some other live stream, but one of my early experiences, this is back in 1977, which for some people is very ancient times. There were some things called charm particles, which were sort of theoretical particles, which there was some indication existed associated with the charm quark. And I did this calculation based on this theory called QCD, the theory of quarks and gluons, field theory of quarks and gluons, that said that if you smash protons together at a certain energy, that you would generate charm particles at a certain rate. And so I'd done this calculation based on QCD. I was pretty sure I'd done the calculation correctly. There was not a lot of wiggle room in the calculation. There was a little bit of wiggle room having to do with kind of how if you have something like a proton, it has sort of three basic quarks in it, but it has a bunch of other stuff of gluons and quarks, anti-quark pairs, and all that kind of thing. And the exact way that worked was not completely nailable down, but one had some idea about that. But anyway, so I did this calculation, and I predicted there will be a certain rate at which these charm particles will be produced in collisions, proton-proton collisions, at particle accelerators, and so on. But there was an experiment that had been done. It was done around the same time I did this theoretical calculation. And the experiment said that they looked for these charm particles being produced, and they'd seen nothing. And they'd seen nothing, I forget whether it was 5 or 10 times below the rate at which I said, you should be seeing these things. So that was a case where I had a theory. I thought the theory is pretty solid because it was based on things that had sort of the underlying kind of theory had been sort of shown to be sensible in lots of other cases. So this was just an extension. This was just an application of that theory to this particular case. So I thought it was probably right. But yet the experiment said, no, it's not right. So what do you do? Well, I was a 17-year-old kid at that time, but I was like sufficiently sure of myself that I'm like, yes, we're going to publish this paper. The first half of it is the calculation. The second half is kind of why the calculation might be wrong, given the theory that was given the particular way the theory is set up. Well, you know, the fact that I'm telling this story, you kind of can guess the end of the story. The experiment turned out to be wrong. And the experiment was wrong in a way that it was a difficult experiment. And the people who'd done it had this particular way of trying to detect these particles. Turns out the particles had characteristics that were a little different than were expected. And so their net for catching these particles effectively just didn't work, and they saw none of them. And because of the way that they've been looking for them. So I learned from that experience that whenever I would do theoretical work on things that related to some experiment, I would go visit the experiment, physically go there and just ask a lot of questions about how the thing really worked and get to the point where I thought I really understood how the experiment was done. And actually, I had a couple of experiences, one fairly dramatic one, where looking at the experiment, it's like, no, this can't possibly be, you know, this effect you're seeing, it can't possibly be a correct interpretation of what's going on in the experiment. So that was kind of the view that the experiment is always kind of on top and telling you what to do. Experiments are hard. Theory is hard too. I mean, and for example, right now I'm sort of trapped in the situation that our underlying theory of physics that kind of tells one about sort of the underlying machine code of physics, getting that to the point where we can say there is a particular experiment you can do looking at, you know, gravitational lensing in some astrophysics situation or something like that. It'll come out this way. It's very hard to go from that underlying theory to the actual experimental predictions that one can look at. In fact, you know, one of the other things that can happen is that we don't know what experiments to do, and it is my strong suspicion that the experiments we might surface to do are ones that already got done. They were already done, and maybe they even gave results which nobody understood, but there are already experiments that have been done. Now, the other problem with experiments that give results that nobody understands tend to get buried because people say, wait a minute, that's too weird. I can't publish that. All my fellow scientists will say, you must have done something wrong because that result is too weird. And so oftentimes experiments that really are quite anomalous in their results just never see the light of day, which is another sort of strange thing. But then when you go outside of physics and you go to areas like biology, the difficulty there is it's extremely hard to do a sort of very well-controlled experiment. You're dealing with a whole mouse or even a whole single biological cell, or even just molecules in different environments. This molecule is in this way with all these water molecules hitting it and so on, etc. It's very hard to get to something where you have sort of a precisely reproducible set of circumstances. That's one thing that's difficult. The other thing that's difficult is the systems you're dealing with just have many, many components. A biological cell will have zillions of molecules in it, arranged in very complicated ways. And it's just the kind of intuition that you have from physics that there's a simple explanation, there's kind of going to be a kind of a narrative law that you can explain, just doesn't work in biology. There's, in some sense, when people say, okay, tell me yes or no, is it the case that the brain the brain is where all kinds of neural processing go on? Yes or no? Well, it's roughly true, but it's not exactly true. There are all kinds of nerve nets that you find in the gut and all kinds of other places, or in the spinal cord and so on. So it's sort of roughly true, but it's not completely true. Now, to just sort of throw out one's hands and say, so we can't make any sort of theoretical type statements about biology, that's also not the right thing to do. But it's hard to, you don't get the same kind of precision that you get in physics. Another thing that makes it difficult is something very fundamental about modeling, something I kind of, discovered in the 1980s. It's a phenomenon I call computational irreducibility. You might think that once you have kind of the underlying rules by which some system operates, once you know, okay, it's just going to follow this program, with these particular computational rules. Once you know those underlying rules, you might think you're done. Then you know everything about what the system will do. Well, at some level, that's correct. You could run that program, you can follow each step, you can see what it does, you'll get some sequence of results. The issue is there a quick way to figure out what's going to happen, or is the only way to figure out what the program is going to do to just follow every step just follow the steps that the program follows? So that's this notion of computational irreducibility, that there's sort of an irreducible amount of computation that has to be done to figure out what the consequences of that program will be. Now, it turns out that whenever there's computational irreducibility, there are always these little pockets of computational reducibility, places where you can jump ahead. It's kind of, I suppose it's like a kind of chutes and ladders type game, snakes and ladders in British English, where you're going along, and every so often you can jump forwards. There are sort of pockets of reducibility to discover in systems that sort of work that way, where you can say, well, mostly it's doing very complicated things, but something about it I can say something simple about. And in fact, that's key to the way that we experience the physical world, I think. Underneath, there's all kinds of computational irreducibility, whether it's the motion of molecules, whether it's features of the atoms of space. It's just full of computationally irreducible behavior. But somehow there are aspects of kind of the large-scale aggregate of that behavior that are somehow simple and that we can perceive in simple ways. So we can, for example, say, oh, we've just got some water we're pouring. We don't have to say we've got this 10 to the trillion molecules in there, and they're all doing these complicated things. We can just say it's just water. It's just pouring in this single aggregate kind of way. So that's an example of sort of a pocket of reducibility that we make use of in the way that we interact with the world. Now, in the case of biology, there's a question of, is the very structure of biological organisms determined by computational irreducibility? And it very much seems that it is. It very much seems that the process of going from the genome, the sort of program in the DNA, to the actual form of the organism, that process involves a certain amount of computational irreducibility, but more to the point, as biological evolution operates on that process, kind of picking one organism rather than another, the things it picks, this kind of the final winning organism, is something whose behavior is full of computational irreducibility. It's not like some machine that we build with simple engineering where it has a bunch of cogs and levers, and you can point at those cogs and levers and you can say, I know why the machine is going to turn this wheel around. It's because it moved that cog, which moved that cog, and so on, where we have a simple narrative explanation. Instead, what's happening in biology is that through biological evolution, biology is picking out sort of lumps of irreducible computational work that get implemented in molecules and so on. It's picking out these lumps of irreducible computational work that happen to do the things that biology needs to do, and it's putting these together, and then that's what we're made of, so to speak. And so when you ask, well, is there a simple explanation for why this or that thing happens? Well, no, there may not be. It's just some lump of computational irreducibility that was sort of noticed by biological evolution 100 million years ago and got used in biological organisms ever since. And it's and that's how biological organisms work. But if you say, tell me why it works that way, give me a theory for how it works, there isn't really a way to do that. It's just, well, it just happens to work that way because when you follow this computation, that's what comes out. Now, the question is, what pockets of computational reducibility are there in biology? What things can you say, particularly in the aggregate, about biological systems? We don't know yet. My strong suspicion is that there are theories of biology that will give you those kinds of sort of general things you can say. One of the things that's very confusing about biology is if you look at a biological cell, for example, it's full of all these molecules. There's some small molecules like water and so on, but then there are lots of big protein molecules that are millions of atoms in size and are built in this very specific way by chains of amino acids and so on, and that fold up in fairly specific shapes. And these proteins can interact with each other in all kinds of complicated ways. And what it seems to be the case is that the operation of biological cells is kind of a bulk orchestrated arrangement of all these molecules where, one molecule, like for muscles, for example, there'll be a molecule that basically just walks down a fiber of another molecule. And it seems very machine-like, so to speak. When you look at it at the very lowest level, you're seeing sort of machine-like things happening that are very much like things we can encode in programs and things like that. But sort of the question is, how do we say when we have all of this sort of intentional looking machines that are doing what they do in a biological cell, what general statement can we make about what they're doing? Sort of similar to asking the question, if we have a microprocessor in a computer and it has 1 billion transistors in it, for example, and they're all doing different things when we run our computer, what can we say sort of in bulk about what that microprocessor is doing? Or even if we have some complicated program and software that we're looking at all the different ways that data flows through that program, what can we say in the aggregate about what's going on in the program? We don't have theories for that yet. I mean, I think to me, the sort of theory of bulk orchestration, which we don't have yet, I've thought about it quite a bit, I haven't figured it out, that's going to be when that is figured out, and it will be figured out, I think, one day, that will be sort of a major step forward in adding sort of a theoretical facet to biology. So that's I think I went quite far afield from the question that was asked here about calculational tools and an actual sort of physical truth. I think the thing to realize is that sometimes, as I mentioned in that example from my youth, so to speak, the calculational tools do better at telling you what's true than the experiment does. Sometimes it's things are complicated enough, and that's true these days still with biology, things are complicated enough that you just have to do the experiment. it's full of computational irreducibility. You really can't sort of jump ahead and get some sort of simple narrative scientific law for what's going on. And I think um, there's also a question of how accurate are these models. So, one feature of models is that you're trying to capture certain aspects of a system and throw others away. You're trying to say, I really want to get right the overall growth rate of this particular object. I don't care whether I get the shape of its boundary right. Or I want to calculate something about the total number of people who get sick in some epidemic. I don't really care about whether, if I looked at the spatial distribution of where people are getting sick, that it's patchy in this place and that place and so on. So models are always approximations, or almost every model is always an approximation. The one case where you have a model that isn't an approximation, is if you can have a model for the whole universe and everything in it. And I think that our model that goes through these hypergraph rewriting and the Rulliad and all that kind of thing, it attempts to be a final, precise model for how the universe works. It's not an approximation. You're throwing nothing away. This model, it's very hard to work out its consequences, but the model is intended to be a precise, identical model for how the universe works. It's not that when we describe the model in terms of graphs and hypergraphs and this and that and the other, it's not to say the universe is made of graphs. It's to say we can describe what the universe does at a human level in terms of things like graphs. The fact that we say there's computations going on at the lowest level in the universe, that's a description of what's happening in the universe that we can understand. And it's our way to make a bridge between kind of what's actually happening in the universe and what our minds, what we can put into our finite minds. But that's so. But in this case, we have an example of a model, the sole example of a model which is not a model anymore. It's not a model in the sense of being an approximation anymore. It's a precise representation of what the universe is supposed to be like. But apart from that model, every other model that one looks at is some kind of approximation where you're capturing some effects and throwing away other effects. That's why, for example, modeling tends to be a very controversial issue, because somebody will say, well, I've got this great model, and somebody will say, but it doesn't capture this aspect. So, for example, for brains, which we were just talking about, you could say, well, my model captures the informational aspects of brains really, really well. And somebody else will say, well, it doesn't capture what happens to a brain if you kind of get sleepy. That's an effect that is, something to do with the detailed kind of molecular physiology of the brain, not captured in your sort of informational computational level description. And so somebody could say, well, that's a lousy model because it doesn't deal with what happens when you get sleepy. But somebody else will say, well, you have a great model for what happens when the brain gets sleepy, but that doesn't explain anything about how the brain manages to produce streams of text and so on. So, that's always sort of a controversy about what you put into models. Now, so then there's a question of, okay, well, you've got your model, whether it's a completely precise model or not, you've got your model. Now, what are the consequences of that model? And this is where computational irreducibility comes in, that it can be very hard to work out the consequences of the model. And sometimes working out the consequences can kind of dig into aspects. It can matter. Things that you approximated away can start mattering in the consequences of the model. And it's like, whoops, this model doesn't have enough in it to be able to say for sure this or that is going to happen. But even the intuition that there's computational irreducibility, and that even given the underlying rules for the model, it can be hard to see what the consequences are. That's an important piece of intuition that people can get very confused about. I mean, for example, during the pandemic, people had these differential equation models for the rate of people getting sick. And particular model, they say this is a mathematical model, and we can work out all the math and so on, and we predict this is exactly the number of people who will get sick next week in such and such a place. Well, a lot of those answers were completely wrong. And sometimes they had some element of correctness to them, but sometimes they were just wrong. And what was going on? Well, the problem in part was that the model was an approximation. In particular, the most common kinds of models, SIR models, um, which stand for susceptible, I stands for they're sick, forget what the word is, and R means recovered, I think. So those kinds of models um, uh, um, have an approximation. Their approximation is that people mix randomly. So if you have some number of people, if 10% of people are sick, then they will sort of randomly mix with all the other people who might not be sick and so on. And then the sort of compartmental versions of these models where you say, well, let's approximate it that all the kids are in school together and the senior citizens are might be in a care facility or something, and they're separate, and we've got these different compartments and so on. But it's an approximation because the fact is, that people have social groups and they collect together in those, and there are people who are sort of whose job involves seeing lots of different people, and there are people who can just hang out on their own and write their novels or something without ever seeing a person. So it's just an approximation, and it was clear, for example, we quickly worked out when the pandemic began that it mattered what this network of sort of the social network of who connects to who. In fact, one of my kids wrote a nice paper about this, about sort of who connects to who, and what the kind of network of connections look like. It matters a lot to what's going to happen to how many people get sick. And so sort of one of the things that can happen is that people say, we got a mathematical model. Great. Then we've solved it. Let's just work out the consequence of that model. We'll know the answer. But it's not the whole story. And often it confuses people because they say, look, there's all this math and we're doing all this sophisticated technical stuff. Doesn't mean it's right. It can still be, it can have multiple problems. It can be something where the foundations of it are very insecure, they're not really right. The approximation doesn't extend far enough. Things happen that sort of dig into things where the approximation breaks down. Computational irreducibility can happen where you can't really make these kind of summarizing models where you really have to follow the details. You can't just sort of say, oh, we can approximate it by the simple equation and so on. So a few aspects of that. And I think it's in a sense, people have been a bit incorrectly blinded by saying we got a mathematical model of something, so therefore we know how it's going to work. And yes, that's caused trouble in lots of areas, whether it's epidemiology, whether it's economics, all these kinds of areas where there are a lot of effects, a lot of complicated effects, and you really can't necessarily summarize them by these simple models. Those kinds of models work much better in physics than they do in other places. Back at the beginning of the 1800s, people imagined that there would be a social physics that kind of described, using methods that are like physics, how society would work. It didn't work out, still hasn't worked out. There are presumably some aggregate laws of the operation of society. So far, they're largely anecdotal kinds of laws, but we don't know, sort of precise laws of that, although there might be some. And my guess is that for example, economics, there are more kinds of aggregate laws than we know so far, although perhaps those aggregate laws are for aspects of economics that aren't particularly ones that we care about or find important. Let's see. Gosh. There's a question from 420 Wing asks in reflection of their handle there, what lessons can we learn from the evolution of flight beyond the mechanics? Richard Dawkins apparently reflects in a book about the broader implications of flight evolution, considering what it reveals about natural selection, adaptation, interconnectedness of life. Well, one question is, how many times did flight how many times did organisms figure out the idea of flying? The answer is several. I don't know exactly how many. It's probably known, or at least one has a pretty good idea of how many times that was discovered in the history of biological evolution as recorded in the fossil record. Of course, we don't know. There could have been, there could have even been a whole form of life that occurred before the form of life that we have with its DNA and RNA and so on. There could have been a previous form of life that maybe provided the environment in which our form of life could arise, and maybe flight was discovered 10 times there and forgotten 10 times there before it started arising for us. But it's interesting that that it's arisen different times in the history of biological evolution. And the thing to understand about flying is it's not about getting the lift to be able to have the air push you up. That's fairly easy to do. Kites do that and so on. What's difficult is to have the control to sort of keep flying in a straight line or however you want to fly, and not have you just sort of have some instability and kind of, one wing loses lift and you kind of crash into the ground. That was the big innovation from the Wright brothers, was a matter of sort of control. And that's the kind of thing that in biology, in order to fly, you kind of have to have a brain. I don't think there's anything that flies without a brain. And I think that's one of the it's one of the kind of things, is that you've got to be able to sense, how things are going. Oh, you're falling in that direction. Okay, flap harder with this wing and so on. You have to have that control system built up in order to be able to fly. That seems to be the important feature of flying. And it's just like, even if you want to walk, you have to have a certain amount of that. If you want to walk on two legs, you have to have an even better version of that to not be falling over all the time. You have to have that control system built up. In the history of human technology, people knew that you could have kites. They knew you could have hot air balloons and things like that, or hydrogen balloons, helium balloons that floated on the air, so to speak, and were sort of passively lifted by the fact that they're lighter than air. They have a lower density than air. But the question of whether you could make a thing that would fly and not sort of crash into the ground. People had all kinds of schemes with all kinds of flapping wings and so on, where people would sort of run along and they would have sort of steam engine-like devices that would flap the wings and so on. It didn't end well. There's all sorts of video, all sorts of film, because movie films existed a little bit before the Wright brothers, and so that means that there's film of people trying to do all these crazy things with flapping to get off the ground and all that kind of stuff. Didn't work. And what made it eventually work was all these ideas about how you can control the flight by having different control surfaces, and how you can set up the configuration of your device so that it tends to, if it tips one way, it'll be pushed back the other way, and so on. That was sort of the key ingredient, and kind of having having something which would sort of actively keep you kind of flying in a straight line, so to speak, or whatever. Now, back in, I don't know, the 1940s, people had thought about, well, what about another good example actually was helicopters, where people were trying to figure out, yes, you could have something which had a rotor turning around and pushing the air down and so on, and you should be able to fly that way. The problem was things would happen, like you would turn the rotor around and the body of the helicopter would rotate in the opposite direction. Well, how do you solve that? Well, eventually you put a rotor on the tail that sort of pushes the helicopter so it won't rotate that way, or sometimes you can have counter-rotating rotors with that slightly different effect. But there are all these sort of little hacks that are needed to add enough stability that the thing will successfully fly. But for example, the idea of making something like a drone, where you have, or a quadcopter, where you have like 4 rotors, and you're kind of just operating those rotors, and the thing will take off and land and all those kinds of things. People tried to make that work it was super difficult. It didn't really work. And part of the reason was that us humans weren't able, having a person sitting in the middle of that thing, trying to sort of pull on one side, push on the other, to change the speeds of the rotors, to keep a quadcopter device stably flying. Just we're not good enough, fast enough at controlling things to make that work. And it took until basically about a decade ago before there started to be flight controllers, electronic flight controllers, microprocessors that could sort of control the rotors well enough that you could have stable flight in something like a quadcopter. It also helped that battery technology got to the point where you could make those motors be electrical ones, and it could kind of lift the weight of the battery and so on. But sort of the key thing was the control process. And I think that this question of, well, for example, what shapes of planes might you have? And that's just like sort of what shapes of bird wings might you have, or what shapes of insect wings might you have? I mean, insects have all kinds of funky stuff that they do, like for example, the wings of an insect, often as they flap, they touch each other on the sort of up flap, so to speak. And that leads to all kinds of ways that sort of a complicated aerodynamic process of pulling air in as the wings peel apart and so on. That seems to be important to the lift that insects get. But I think there's this question of, if you look at the evolution of planes and so on, what do the shapes of their wings change? Do the shapes of their tails change? Well, the answer is there are occasionally sort of more exotic planes that have sort of all the wings at the back and the tail-like control is at the front, things like this. There are delta wing planes where there's a sort of a big wing area and so on. But planes tend to have tails that have sort of a vertical stabilizer on the tail that prevents some sort of instability yawing back and forth of the plane and so on. And there is an interesting question. What are the possible configurations of things like wings that one could invent? And in biology, biology has a particular way to sort of invent things. And, you can try certain kinds of things, but some things you might try, it's hard to get to that thing through things that would kind of partly work. So what does that mean? I mean, if you want a big creature that has wheels, for example, it seems to be hard to get to wheels through things that are partly wheels, so to speak. It seems. I mean, I'm not sure that's really correct, but at least one's imagination tends to say it either rolls completely or it's not a wheel. And to roll completely, you have to figure out how do you get blood supply and nerves and so on to the wheel. It's all a bit complicated. Now, there are certainly microscopic organisms that have flagella, like bacteria, that have things that are wheel-like, that operate at the level of individual molecules, but big organisms haven't sort of gone from, oh, I was walking and now I want wheels kind of thing, possibly because you kind of can't get to wheels incrementally very easily. Although when I say that, one of the things that I've learned from studying sort of the computational universe of possible computational organisms, so to speak, is they're always smarter than you are. They'll find a way to get to something that you never expected was there. And that maybe when you first look at it, you say, that's kind of a cheat. When I defined rotary motion, I was thinking of this, but actually something that satisfied my definition is what it managed to do. And I think there are things like that where, but this question of sort of what configurations of flying creatures can there be? There's sort of how biology can get to that, and that's how we can get to that with engineering. And with engineering, again, it tends to be an incremental process. You make one plane, you make a small change to it. The idea that you start completely from scratch and you say, I'm going to just design something that flies from nothing hasn't been done often and is a difficult thing to do. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some kind of device that is a wonderful flying device with all kinds of characteristics. I'll give you an example of a small change like that. Came in the 1990s, I guess, winglets, which are these, you look at the wings of a plane, sometimes it will have these vertical pieces at the ends of the wings. And, the main lift of a plane comes from from the fact that the wings are, well, roughly tipped up a bit, and they also have a certain shape, and there's kind of pressure of air pushing from underneath the wings. That's what kind of keeps the plane up, so to speak. So you say, well, what's the point of having something at the end of the wings that's just vertical? Well, it's a more subtle issue. What happens is planes like big, commercial planes and corporate jets and other things, big jet planes fly at pretty close to the speed of sound, and there are flows of air over the wings that get essentially the speed of sound. And in that kind of in that regime of so-called transonic flow, so once you get to the speed of sound, the flow over a plane changes dramatically, and as you, because the plane is kind of has to make this shock through the air, the sort of the sound of the plane moving, the perturbations in the air that the plane makes when it's traveling faster than the speed of sound, the plane, those perturbations sort of never catch up with the plane. And so you end up with this cone of sort of change in the air, that is what leads to when that cone of change sort of intersects the ground, that leads to a sonic boom that you hear. But it's a change of the pressure of the air from one side to the other, or velocity of the air from one side to the other. It's a discontinuous change that happens once you get to the speed of sound. That's the configuration at that point. As you get very close to the speed of sound, there are all kinds of instabilities that start to show up in the way that the air flows over the wings and so on, as it sort of gets ready to make these discontinuous changes. And the way those instabilities work, it's believed at least, that these winglets help sort of damp down those instabilities, leading the plane to have more lift, even in this regime where there would otherwise be these instabilities starting to develop. So the configuration of wings, that was sort of a late stage discovery about what you could do with wings that changes kind of the shape of wings on lots of kinds of planes. And there are quite possibly many more discoveries like that to be made. I mean, the fundamental shape of wings, the airfoil shape, that's kind of hasn't changed much over the years. There are little tweaks that get made. There are little fences that get put on wings to little things that stick up from the wing an inch or so that are to break up the airflow over the wing and change the sort of the friction of the air flowing over the wing. But there are no doubt many other inventions like that could be made, and maybe the wings of planes of the future will look visually very different from what they look like today, and sort of in a way that, again, in biology, there have been certain different wing configurations that have been made, but it's not, they tend to form definite families. It's let's see, we should probably wrap it up there. I got to go back to my day job. Actually, I'm doing a live stream about reviewing design for some features in the upcoming version of Wolfram Language, which is my day job. So we should probably leave it there. Thank you for a lot of interesting questions. I hope to get to more of them another time. But thanks for joining me now, and see you another time.